They called her a liability, a placeholder, a fat girl playing dress-up in a world that ate people like her for breakfast and didn't bother wiping its mouth after. In the New York underworld, a boss's wife was supposed to be architecture, something beautiful and structural and ultimately decorative. She was supposed to stand at his side at Cipriani events and smile with teeth that cost more than most people's cars. And she was never, under any circumstances, supposed to have opinions about anything louder than which centerpiece arrangement she preferred. Marguerite? No, wait. That name was already somewhere in the file. Abigail Voss had opinions about everything. She had opinions about the inferior binding on the first edition Dostoevsky she'd found at a Brooklyn estate sale for $11, and she had opinions about the structural instability of the Torino family's money laundering operation, which she'd identified from public real estate filings in under 40 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, with a cup of gas station coffee going cold beside her laptop. She had opinions about the rain, and whether it was interesting or just wet, and she'd concluded it was mostly just wet, unless you were in a specific kind of mood. What she did not have, until the morning of October 14th, was a husband. By noon, she had one. His name was Soren Voss, no relation to her, despite the name they now shared, which was a detail that would confuse people for years, and he was 41 years old, and he ran the northeastern operations of the Voss syndicate, which was not the largest criminal organization in New York, but was arguably the most precise. Soren did not operate with excess. He operated the way a surgeon operated. Clean incisions, minimal blood, maximum effect. He had not wanted a wife. He had needed one. The distinction mattered to Abigail more than she let on. It started with the Callaway Summit, a diplomatic assembly of 5 crime families held every 3 years in a neutral location, where grievances were aired, alliances were redrawn, and marriages were occasionally arranged like poker trades. Soren had arrived without a partner, which was not unusual for him. What was unusual was the pressure the Faraday family had started applying 6 months prior, pushing for a merger that would technically make Soren the junior partner in his own operation. The Faradays wanted leverage. They wanted access. They wanted Soren vulnerable in some way, any way. And the oldest vulnerability in the book was isolation. A man without a family was a man without stakes, without something to protect, allegedly without softness. The Faradays had been whispering this through every channel available to them. Soren Voss bleeds alone. He has no one. He is a machine, and machines can be replaced. What they needed Soren to do, without realizing he was doing it, was prove them right. So Soren did what Soren always did when backed against a wall. He thought 3 steps ahead. The arrangement was handled through a lawyer named Gerald. Not the same Gerald from anything before, just a Gerald. Because there are always Geralds in these stories, men in charcoal suits who exist purely to deliver news that changes your life in a conference room with bad lighting. Abigail had gone to this particular Gerald because he handled estates, and she was trying to settle her late aunt's affairs. And somewhere between signing forms, she found herself in a conversation that pivoted, sharply and without warning, into a different conversation entirely. Gerald cleared his throat. Soren Voss, he explained, was looking for a specific kind of arrangement, contractual. Time-limited in theory, though the details were negotiable. He needed a wife who was intelligent, discreet, and not looking for love. He was prepared to be generous. He was not prepared to be emotional about it. Abigail had looked at Gerald for a long moment. He wants a professional, she said. He wants someone who understands the terms. She'd understood the terms. She also understood that her aunt's medical debts were sitting at $460,000, and that her own salary as a forensic accountant at a firm that didn't deserve her was not going to make a meaningful dent in that number within any timeline that mattered. She said yes. Later, she would think about that yes and what it contained. It wasn't desperation exactly. It was more like calculation. She'd run the numbers the way she ran every set of numbers that crossed her desk, and the numbers had suggested that this was the most efficient path through a problem that didn't have a clean solution. She hadn't thought about what it would feel like to walk into Cipriani on the arm of a man who barely looked at her during the ceremony. The wedding was a Tuesday. Small by underworld standards, which still meant 47 guests and a flower arrangement that cost more than Abigail's monthly rent. She wore a dress that had been selected by Soren's assistant, not unkindly, but not warmly either, and it was a good dress. It fit her the way good clothes always fit her. Like the clothes had been designed for someone with her measurements, but not quite her, and everything had made a compromise to meet somewhere in the middle. She'd fixed her own hair. She'd done her own makeup. She'd walked in ready to be invisible. The room had other ideas. Abigail was aware of the looks the moment she crossed the threshold. Not the polite social scan that happened at any gathering, but the other kind. The kind that moved in a specific direction from shoes upward and arrived at a conclusion before it reached the face. She'd been the recipient of that look her entire adult life. She knew its geography intimately. The whispers were more creative than she'd anticipated. A woman in a green dress, one of the Faraday wives, Abigail would later learn, leaned toward the woman beside her and said, at a volume that suggested she didn't care who heard, "He really chose her. Does he want them laughing at the summit? Or is that the point?" A man near the bar, silver-haired and self-satisfied. "I've seen better strategic decisions from people who were actively being shot at. Someone else not bothering to lower their voice at all. At least she'll be hard to miss. The Faradays will see her from across the room." Abigail had reached for a glass of water from the nearest tray, taken a calm sip and thought, "Keep talking. I'm memorizing all of it." Soren appeared at her side 5 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin. He was taller than she'd expected from the photographs Gerald had shown her. The photographs, she understood now, had been taken with the particular angle favored by people who wanted to appear slightly less intimidating than they were. He was lean and dark-haired with grey starting at his temples, and he moved like a man who had long since stopped worrying about what room he was walking into. He looked at her once, briefly, the way you'd look at a contract you'd already read. Satisfied that it was what it was supposed to be. "Ready," he said. "I've been ready since 9 this morning," she said. "I got here early and had coffee in the lobby." "The lobby coffee was terrible, by the way. You should know that about your venue." Something almost happened on his face. Not quite a smile. A slight recalibration. "I'll file a complaint," he said. "I already did," she said. "With the front desk. They were very apologetic." He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked into the room that had been talking about her for 40 minutes. The Callaway Summit happened 6 days later, and the Faraday family arrived with the specific energy of people who believed they already knew the punchline. Bertram Faraday, broad-shouldered, 60-something, with the handshake of a man who wanted you to know it was a handshake, made his way toward Soren within 20 minutes of arrival and spent exactly 3 seconds looking at Abigail before redirecting his gaze entirely, which was its own kind of statement. "Congratulations on the marriage," he said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "Thank you," Soren said pleasantly. "Abigail, this is Bertram. He runs the Faraday interests out of New Haven and occasionally, when he's feeling optimistic, New York." Abigail shook Bertram's hand. "I've been reading about your waterfront development project," she said. "The one in Bridgeport. The permitting timeline is interesting. You filed 4 variance requests in 8 months. That's ambitious." Bertram looked at her properly for the first time. "It's a complex project," he said. "I'm sure it is," Abigail said warmly. "I just find it interesting how the 3rd variance overlapped with the city council election cycle. Good timing." Bertram was still smiling, but the smile had changed shape slightly. "Are you in real estate?" he asked. "Forensic accounting," she said, among other things. Later, back in their suite, Soren poured 2 glasses of water from the minibar and set one in front of her without asking. "You didn't tell me you'd researched the Faradays," he said. "You didn't ask what I did with my Tuesday afternoons." He sat down across from her. He looked at her for a moment, a different kind of looking than before, the kind that was actually trying to see something. "What else do you know?" he said. She told him. It took 40 minutes. The marriage settled into something that was not warmth, exactly, but was not cold either. It was efficient. They had separate rooms in the brownstone on the Upper West Side that served as Soren's primary residence, and they had dinner together 3 times a week, and Abigail learned quickly that Soren did not make small talk, but was genuinely interested in ideas, and she had more of those than she had space for in her own head, so they talked about ideas instead. She did not think she was falling in love with him. She thought she was finding someone whose brain worked at a frequency she could actually hear. It was not the same thing. Or it was. She hadn't decided. The problem arrived on a Thursday in November. Soren had flown to Chicago for a meeting with the Delacroix intermediaries. A routine trip, the kind that happened 4 times a year, and was notable primarily for the fact that it required him to take a 6 a.m. flight, which he hated with a focused and specific hatred that Abigail had found privately charming. He was due back Friday evening. Abigail was home alone, which was not unusual. She had a book, a proper one, 1,000 pages, Russian, not the Dostoevsky but a different one, equally committed to suffering as a literary device. And she had a mug of chamomile tea, and she had approximately 400 pages left, and she was, by any reasonable measure, completely occupied. The first indication that Thursday was going to become something else was the sound of the kitchen door. Not the front door, not the main entrance. The kitchen entrance, which was accessible through the service alley, and which required a specific kind of knowledge about the building's layout that guests did not have and repairmen did not use at 10:45 at night. Abigail set down her book. She thought, "That's interesting." She did not reach for her phone. She did not call out. She sat very still in the chair by the library window and listened, the way she had learned to listen when she was 8 years old, and her stepfather came home in a certain kind of mood, and the specific quality of sound was the only reliable information available. 2 people in the kitchen, moving quietly but not silently. Professional quiet, which was its own category. Then, from somewhere near the front of the house, a third sound, which meant they hadn't come through just the kitchen door, she thought. 3 at minimum, she thought. The book is going to have to wait. What the 3 men who had entered the Voss brownstone on that Thursday night in November had not known, could not have known, because the information wasn't available in any of the files they'd been given about Abigail, was that she had spent 4 years working financial investigations for a private security firm before she'd moved to the accounting practice, and that the private security firm had had a training protocol for its investigators that was significantly more comprehensive than most people assumed, and that Abigail had approached that protocol the same way she approached everything, methodically, thoroughly, and with the specific motivation of someone who understood that competence was the only thing no one could take from her. She was not, it should be noted, a trained fighter in any cinematic sense. She was simply someone who had been paying attention for 31 years and had very good instincts about geometry. The library was on the 2nd floor. The main staircase was the obvious route up, which meant it was also the obvious route to cover. She moved quickly and without sound down the hallway to the linen closet, which was, structurally speaking, not a linen closet at all, but a closet that contained linens on 3 shelves, and on the floor behind a folded duvet, a lockbox that Soren had shown her during their 2nd week in the house. She'd thought at the time that it was a formality, something husbands in his world did. Show the wife where the emergency resources were, the way you'd show a new tenant where the fire extinguisher lived. She opened the lockbox. She looked at what was inside. She thought, okay, this is fine. The first man came up the stairs at 10:52. She knew this because the 3rd step from the top had a specific sound, not a creak, exactly, more of a subtle compression, that Soren's regular staff had learned to step around and that someone who didn't live in the house wouldn't know to avoid. She was already in position. What followed was not elegant. Later, she would be honest with herself about this. It was not elegant, it was not graceful, and it certainly wasn't the kind of thing she would have chosen to spend a Thursday evening doing. But it was effective. She had learned early in her life and reaffirmed at many subsequent points that effectiveness was what the situation required, not elegance. The second man came up 4 minutes after the first. The third came up 6 minutes after that, moving carefully, which suggested he'd heard something and wasn't sure what. Being careful was not the same as being prepared for what was waiting in the hallway outside the master bedroom. Abigail had not gone to the master bedroom. She had let him walk past her. Timing, she had always believed, was just math with higher stakes. By 11:15, the house was quiet again. Abigail was sitting on the bottom stair with a glass of water she'd poured herself from the kitchen sink, because her hands needed something to do and tea required more steps than she had patience for at the moment. She had called the number Soren had given her, not 911, a different number, a number that answered on the second ring regardless of the time, and spoken 8 sentences. Then she'd ended the call and sat down with her water and waited. She was, to be honest with herself, a little shaky. Not badly, but the kind of shaky that happened when your body had spent adrenaline it hadn't budgeted for and was now presenting you with the invoice. She was also furious, not afraid, not even particularly disturbed, in the grand sense. Furious. She had been approximately 400 pages from the end of a book she'd been carrying around for 3 weeks, and she had been warm, and the tea had been at exactly the right temperature, and now there were 3 men who were going to require a great deal of administrative follow-up, and she was going to have to find a new copy of the book because the current one was on the floor of the library, and she wasn't entirely sure she wanted it back. Soren walked through the front door at 2:17 a.m. He had taken the first available flight back the moment his phone had rung. He stood in the entrance of his own house and looked at her, sitting on the stair with her glass of water and her expression of contained irritation. He looked at the evidence of the evening's events. He looked back at her. "I'm annoyed," she said. "I was almost at the good part. The book, yes, the book." He was quiet for a moment. "Abigail," he said. "I know," she said. "I know. We'll deal with it." He crossed the entrance hall and sat down on the stair beside her, which was not something she would have predicted him doing. He was a man who handled things from a standing position. He did not sit on stairs. He sat on the stair. He said very quietly, "I didn't know this was coming. I want you to believe that." "I believe you," she said. "You're not careless. Someone thought you were." "The Faradays," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at his hands for a moment. "I underestimated how far they'd go. I thought the summit would buy us more time before they made a move. I put you at risk." He paused. "I put you here and I put you at risk." Abigail considered this. She was aware that this was a moment that required something from her, and she was also aware that she didn't entirely know what she felt, only that it was more complicated than either of the things she'd been trying not to feel for the past 8 weeks. "You put me somewhere interesting," she said finally. "I'll grant you that." He looked at her sideways. "You know what the worst part is," she said. "I have opinions about the Faraday financials that you haven't even heard yet. The Bridgeport project is the small thing. The medium-sized thing is their shipping contracts. The large thing is what they've been doing with the pension accounts of their own people, which is the kind of thing that, if the right information found its way to the right people, would make Bertram Faraday's week significantly worse than mine." Soren was very still. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since the summit," she said. "I've been building the file. I didn't want to bring it to you until it was complete. I wanted to be sure. How complete is it?" She looked at him steadily. "Complete enough that we wouldn't need to worry about the Faradays for a long time." Something changed in his face. Not dramatically. Soren Voss did not do things dramatically. But the shift was there, and Abigail, who had spent the past 8 weeks learning to read the small changes in a face that wasn't designed to be read, caught it. It was not calculation. It was not the look he'd given her in Gerald's conference room, or the brief, assessing glance before the ceremony. It was something else. "You've been building them a case," he said. "While they were building a case against us." "I thought it was the appropriate response," she said. "You thought—" He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. "You are something else, Abigail Voss." "It's my name now," she agreed. "I should probably start acting like it." The Faraday situation resolved itself over the following 2 weeks with the specific efficiency that happened when someone with Abigail's skills assembled information with the intention of delivering it precisely where it would do the most damage. The pension fraud alone was enough to destabilize 3/4 of the Faraday organization's internal loyalty structure. Because there is nothing that turns a man against his employer faster than learning that his employer has been stealing from the people who trusted him most. Bertram Faraday, by the end of November, had more problems than the Voss marriage to concern himself with. He never made another move against them. Whether this was wisdom or self-preservation was difficult to say, and Abigail was inclined to believe there was less distinction between those two things than people generally assumed. The brownstone on the Upper West Side got a new security protocol in December, which Abigail had significant input on, and which included, among other things, a different arrangement for the kitchen entrance. She also got a proper desk in what had previously been an unused sitting room on the 2nd floor, with a window that faced the street and enough shelving for all the books she'd been keeping in boxes since her last apartment. Soren had arranged both things without being asked, she noticed. She also noticed that dinner happened 4 times a week now instead of 3, and that he'd started asking her opinion on things that were not strictly speaking her area of involvement, and that there was a copy of the Dostoevsky. A first edition, not an $11 estate sale find, something considerably more significant, that had appeared on her desk one morning with no note attached. She'd gone to find him. "There's no note," she said. "No," he agreed. "That makes it harder to know what it means." "It means," he said, setting down his coffee and looking at her with the same directness he gave everything, "that I went to 3 different rare book dealers before I found a copy in the right condition, and I thought about writing a note and I couldn't work out what to say." She looked at him for a moment. "You could have just said thank you," she said, "for Thursday." "That isn't all it was," he said. The city was doing what the city always did in December, cold, grey, relentless, beautiful in a way that required you to accept a certain amount of structural suffering. Through the window of the sitting room that was now her office, Abigail could see the street below, the yellow cabs, the woman walking a very small dog in a coat that was frankly too thin for the weather. Soren Voss was standing in the doorway of her office with no particular reason to be there. She thought about the contract that Gerald had presented. The time-limited arrangement, negotiable in the details. She thought about the numbers she'd run on a Tuesday afternoon, the most efficient path through a problem that didn't have a clean solution. The thing about numbers, she had learned over the course of 31 years of paying very close attention, was that they sometimes solved for variables you hadn't known you were carrying. "I've been thinking," she said, about renegotiating the terms," she said. "The original arrangement was built around a specific set of assumptions. Several of those assumptions have turned out to be incorrect." He was quiet. "Primarily," she said, "the assumption that this was temporary." He moved from the doorway into the room. He stood at the window beside her and looked at the street below, and the woman with the inadequately dressed dog, who had stopped to let the dog smell something on the curb with great intensity. "That assumption," he said carefully, "became incorrect for me some time ago." "When?" she said. "The summit," he said. "When you told Bertram Faraday you'd noticed the variance filings." She turned to look at him. "That was 6 days after the wedding." "Yes, Soren. I know," he said. She thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about sitting on the stair at 2 a.m. with a glass of water and her hands still slightly unsteady. and him sitting down beside her on the floor of his own entrance hall, and the way he'd said her name. She thought about the book with no note. She thought, the math on this worked out differently than I planned. Well, she said, we have a lot to talk about. Yes, he said. He sounded, for a man who did not do things dramatically, almost relieved. Outside, the woman with the small dog had given up trying to move and was simply standing there, letting the dog have its moment with whatever was on the curb. A taxi went past. The city continued doing what it always did, indifferent, enormous, entirely unconcerned with the two people standing at a second-floor window, recalculating everything they thought they knew about how this was going to go. The Faradays, by the following spring, had ceased to be relevant to anyone's calculations. The brownstone had more books in it than it had started with, which was saying something. And Abigail Voss, who had been called a placeholder and a liability and several other things she'd chosen to remember, with more clarity than was probably healthy, had turned out to be, in the end, exactly what the situation required. She always had been. She'd just been waiting for someone to stop talking long enough to notice.